The smoke alarm shrieked through the house at 3:47 a.m., jolting me from the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. My feet hit the hardwood floor of my bedroom before my brain fully processed what was happening. The acrid smell of burning paper filled my nostrils as I stumbled toward my door, heart hammering against my ribs. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I yanked open my bedroom door and immediately saw the orange glow flickering from downstairs. My stepmother Patricia stood in our kitchen, silhouetted against the flames dancing in our stone fireplace. She was feeding sheets of paper into the fire, one by one, with the methodical precision of someone destroying evidence.my college essays. Every single draft, every revision, every handwritten note I'd spent months perfecting. The personal statements that had taken me through 17 different versions. The supplemental essays I'd crafted specifically for each university. The scholarship applications that represented my only shot at affording my dream schools. All of it disappearing into orange flames that licked hungrily at my future. Patricia turned when she heard my footsteps on the stairs, her face twisted into something between satisfaction and malice. The designer silk robe she wore made her look like some twisted version of a 1950s housewife, complete with the pearl necklace that caught the firelight as she moved. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled even at this ungodly hour, as if she'd prepared for this moment. "Oh good, you're awake," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I was just cleaning out some old papers that were cluttering up the house. Amazing how much junk accumulates, don't you think?" I watched in horror as she picked up another sheet. My essay about growing up with a single father after my mother died in a car accident when I was 8. The essay about how Dad and I had built our own little family, just the two of us against the world, until Patricia arrived 3 years ago and turned our peaceful home into a battlefield. "Stop," I whispered, then louder, my voice cracking. "Stop! Those are mine." I lunged forward, but Patricia held up her hand, the papers clutched in her manicured fingers like weapons. The fire crackled behind her, waiting to consume the last pieces of work that represented 4 years of my life. "These?" She waved the essays in the air. "These little stories about your tragic childhood? About how difficult it was for you to accept me as your new mother? About how you've overcome so much adversity?" The way she said it made my experiences sound like lies, like manufactured drama I'd created for sympathy.my throat closed up. Those essays weren't just assignments. They were pieces of my soul I'd carved out and refined until they gleamed. They represented every late night I'd spent hunched over my laptop, every conversation with my English teacher Mrs. Rodriguez who'd helped me find my voice, every tear I'd shed while writing about Mom's death and how it had shaped me into someone who fought for what mattered. Patricia smiled that cold smile I'd grown to recognize over the past 3 years. The same expression she wore when she'd thrown away my mother's jewelry, claiming it was taking up too much space in her new walk-in closet. The same look she'd given me when she'd redecorated my childhood bedroom without asking, painting over the growth marks Dad had penciled on my doorframe since I was 5. "You know what your problem is, Sophia?" She took another step toward the fireplace. "You think the world owes you something because your mother died. Well, newsflash, sweetheart. Nobody cares about your sob story. Admissions officers see right through manufactured trauma. They want real achievers, not professional victims." The words hit me like physical blows. Professional victim. As if losing my mother at 8 years old was some kind of career choice. As if the nights I'd spent comforting Dad while he cried into his coffee mug were performances. As if building myself back up from a broken little girl into someone strong enough to maintain a 4.0 GPA while working part-time to help with our finances was somehow cheating. I thought about the essay currently in her hands. The one about how Mom used to read me law cases as bedtime stories because she'd been a paralegal who dreamed of becoming a judge. How I'd inherited her passion for justice and her belief that everyone deserved a fair chance. How I'd decided to become a civil rights attorney to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Patricia had never read these essays before tonight. Dad kept my academic work in a special folder in his home office, proud of every assignment, every A+, every teacher's comment about my potential. She must have broken into his locked filing cabinet. The thought of her reading my most personal thoughts, my deepest memories, my carefully crafted words about my mother, made me feel violated in a way I couldn't articulate. "Where's Dad?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Chicago. Big case, remember? Won't be back until Sunday." Her smile widened. "Just us girls for the whole weekend." My father was a corporate attorney who traveled frequently for work. Patricia had timed this perfectly. She knew I'd be defenseless, knew I'd have no backup, no protection. She'd planned this moment of maximum damage when I'd be completely alone. With her, I watched her feed another page into the flames. My essay about starting a tutoring program for underprivileged kids at the community center. The one about how watching my father fight for his clients had inspired me to pursue law. The supplemental essay for Yale that had taken me 6 weeks to perfect, analyzing how the legal system could better serve marginalized communities, years of work, months of refinement, countless hours of pouring my heart onto paper, trying to distill my entire being into words that would convince admissions committees I was worth their investment. All of it turning to ash because this woman couldn't stand the idea of me succeeding. Why? The question escaped my lips before I could stop it. Patricia paused, holding my Columbia University supplemental essay. The one about my volunteer work at the women's shelter downtown, where I'd helped survivors of domestic violence navigate legal resources. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman now terrorizing me in my own home was destroying my words about helping other women escape similar situations. Because you don't deserve any of this, she said simply. You walk around this house like you're some kind of princess, like the world revolves around your precious college applications. Your father spends thousands of dollars on your SAT prep, your debate team, your extracurriculars. Meanwhile, my son Jason can barely afford community college. Jason. Her 21-year-old son from her first marriage who'd moved in with us 6 months ago. The same Jason who spent his days playing video games in our basement and his nights getting arrested for underage drinking. The same Jason who'd stolen money from my purse twice before Dad finally installed a lock on my bedroom door. Jason doesn't want to go to college, I pointed out. He's told everyone he thinks education is a scam designed to keep people in debt. That's not the point. Patricia's voice rose to a shriek. The point is that you get everything handed to you while real kids have to struggle. You get the perfect grades, the perfect scores, the perfect teachers who write you recommendation letters. Life has been too easy for you, Sophia. Time to learn what real hardship looks like. Real hardship. As if losing my mother wasn't real enough. As if watching my father cry himself to sleep for 2 years wasn't hard enough. As if rebuilding our family from scratch, learning to cook dinner at 9 years old because Dad was too depressed to leave his bedroom, wasn't struggling enough. As if working 20 hours a week at the local diner since I turned 16, saving every penny for college application fees while maintaining straight A's and running the debate team, wasn't real work. As if tutoring kids for free every Saturday morning while Patricia slept off her wine hangovers wasn't enough contribution to the world. She tossed the Columbia essay into the flames. I watched my words about fighting for justice curl and blacken, disappearing into smoke that would drift up the chimney and vanish into the October night. The essay that had taken me 3 months to write, that Mrs. Rodriguez had called breathtaking, and the kind of writing that changes admissions officers' lives. Gone. Patricia reached for the next stack. My personal statement for Harvard. The crown jewel of my application portfolio. 15 pages of my best writing, chronicling my journey from a grieving child to a determined young woman ready to change the world. The essay that connected my mother's dream of becoming a judge to my own ambition to reform the legal system from within. Please, I begged, stepping forward with my hands outstretched. Please don't. I'll rewrite them all. I'll write new ones. But those are my only copies of the final drafts. The applications are due in 2 weeks. Should have thought of that before you decided to be so special. Patricia held the Harvard essay inches from the flames. You know what your problem is? You actually believe you deserve Harvard. You actually think some dead woman's dreams should become your reality just because you share DNA. The casual cruelty in her voice when she referred to my mother as some dead woman sent something cold and sharp through my chest. My mother hadn't just been a dreamer. She'd been a fighter who'd worked her way through paralegal school while raising me as a single mom after my biological father disappeared. She'd met Dad when I was 7, and they'd had exactly 1 beautiful year together before the drunk driver ran the red light. My mother was more accomplished at 25 than you'll ever be at 45, I said, finding my voice through the rage. She earned her paralegal certification while working full-time and raising a daughter alone. She was planning to start law school when she met Dad. She wasn't just dreaming about becoming a judge. She was going to do it. Patricia's perfectly made-up face twisted with fury. Your saint of a mother is dead, Sophia. Dead people don't get to dictate living people's lives. Your father has moved on. Maybe it's time you did too. She thrust the Harvard essay toward the fire. I dove forward, grabbing for the papers, but Patricia jerked them away. In the struggle, several pages scattered across the kitchen floor. I scrambled to collect them, my knees hitting the cold tile as I gathered the sheets that represented my entire future. The personal statement was singed along one edge but mostly intact. My Stanford supplemental was fine. But my Princeton essay about overcoming family trauma lay partially under Patricia's designer slipper, and when she noticed, she ground her heel into it deliberately, tearing the paper and smearing ink across. The tile. Oops, she said with fake concern. How clumsy of me. I clutched the remaining papers to my chest, backing away from her toward the kitchen island. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold on to the essays. For years of high school. For years of perfect grades, of sacrificing social events to study, of working every weekend to save money for application fees. For years of building toward this moment when I'd finally have the chance to honor my mother's memory by achieving the dreams she'd never gotten to pursue. Patricia moved toward the fireplace again, this time holding my MIT application essay. The one about how losing my mother had inspired me to study biomedical engineering, hoping to develop technologies that could predict and prevent the kind of brain injuries that had killed her instantly. The one that had taken me 47 drafts to get right because I kept crying every time I wrote about the accident. Here's what's going to happen, Patricia said, her voice taking on that sing-song quality she used when she was about to deliver particularly devastating news. You're going to accept that community college is a perfectly respectable option for someone of your background. You're going to stop filling your father's head with expensive fantasies about Ivy League schools. And you're going to start contributing more to this household instead of treating it like a hotel while you chase impossible dreams. Someone of my background. The phrase echoed in my head as I watched her wave my MIT essay like a victory flag. What did that mean, exactly? The background of a girl whose mother died young? The background of someone who'd worked since she was legally allowed to, who'd never asked for anything except the chance to earn her way to a better life, or did she mean something else entirely? Something about how Dad and I had lived modestly before she arrived, how we'd been content with our small house and our quiet dinners and our tradition of watching old movies together on Sunday nights. How we'd been happy in our grief, in our memories, in our determination to make my mother proud even though she couldn't see our progress. Patricia had changed all of that. Suddenly our house wasn't big enough, wasn't fancy enough, wasn't impressive enough. We'd had to move to this McMansion in the suburbs, complete with a 3-car garage for her BMW, her son's pickup truck, and Dad's practical Honda. We'd had to join the country club where she played tennis badly and gossiped expertly. We'd had to start hosting dinner parties for her real estate colleagues, events where I was expected to serve wine and smile politely while grown adults made jokes about David's brilliant daughter, as if intelligence in a teenager was somehow amusing rather than promising. The fireplace roared as Patricia fed it another page. This time it was my Brown University essay about social justice, the one where I'd written about how my mother's death had taught me that life was unfair but that didn't mean we had to accept injustice passively. The one where I'd connected my volunteer work at the legal aid clinic to my dreams of representing people who couldn't afford quality representation. You know what I think happened here? Patricia continued, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone as if we were old friends. Sharing secrets. I think you've been living in a fantasy world for so long that you've forgotten what reality looks like. Your mother filled your head with these grand ideas about college and careers and changing the world. But your mother never actually achieved any of those things, did she? The words landed like a slap across my face. My mother had died at 28, just 6 months before she was supposed to start law school. She deferred enrollment twice, first to work and save money, then to help care for her own mother during a long illness. She'd been planning to start classes that fall, had already bought her textbooks, had already registered for her first semester schedule, but Patricia was technically right. My mother had never become a lawyer. She'd never become a judge. She died with her law books still in boxes, her dreams still unrealized, her potential still untapped. The cruel mathematics of Patricia's logic was that dead people couldn't be successful, no matter how much they'd accomplished or how much they'd planned to accomplish. She was going to start law school that fall, I said, my voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. She was accepted to 3 different programs. She chose the one with the best evening schedule so she could still take care of me during the day. Going to, planning to, supposed to. Patricia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Those are the words of dreamers, not achievers. Your mother spent her whole life making excuses for why she couldn't quite reach her goals. Don't make the same mistake. I watched her reach for my University of Chicago essay, the one about how witnessing my father's grief had taught me about the importance of mental health resources in underserved communities. The one where I'd written about starting a support group for other teenagers who'd lost parents, and how that experience had shown me the power of combining legal advocacy with therapeutic intervention. The fire seemed to be getting bigger, hungrier. Patricia had added some kind of accelerant to make sure my work burned completely. The flames reached toward the mantel where family photos were displayed. Photos of Dad and me from before Patricia, back when our smiles were genuine and uncomplicated. Photos of my mother holding me as a baby, her young face bright with hope and determination. Those essays represented 4 years of my life, I said, taking a step toward her. The heat from the fireplace made sweat break out across my forehead. Despite the October chill that had settled over our house. For years of work. Of trying to honor her memory. For years of wallowing, Patricia corrected. For years of using your mother's death as an excuse to demand special treatment. Do you know how exhausting it is to watch you play the grieving daughter card every time someone compliments your grades? How tiresome it is to hear about your dead mother's dreams at every family gathering. Family gathering. As if Patricia's wine-soaked dinner parties where she showed me off like a trained pet counted as family. As if the forced conversations with her boring friends who always asked about my plans in that condescending tone adults used when they wanted to remind teenagers that their dreams were probably unrealistic. I thought about last month's party. Where I'd been cornered by Patricia's friend Margaret, a woman who'd married into old money and had never worked a day in her life. She'd asked about my college plans while sipping her third glass of wine, and when I'd mentioned Harvard, she'd actually laughed. Harvard, she'd said loud enough for the entire room to hear. Isn't that a bit ambitious for someone from your background? Maybe something more practical would be better. Teaching, perhaps? Or nursing? Those are lovely careers for young women. Patricia had stood behind Margaret, nodding along with every word, her face glowing with satisfaction as I'd been publicly humiliated in my own home. She'd later told Dad that Margaret was just being realistic and that maybe I should consider more achievable goals. Now she was taking that realism to its logical conclusion. If I couldn't dream big, if I couldn't reach high, if I couldn't honor my mother's memory by achieving what she'd never gotten the chance to achieve, then I didn't deserve even the chance to try. The fire popped loudly as another essay caught and flared. My Georgetown piece about criminal justice reform. The one where I'd interviewed 3 different defense attorneys about the challenges of representing low-income clients. The one that had taken me 2 months to research and write because I'd wanted to understand the system from every angle before proposing changes. Patricia, please. I was crying now, hot tears that made the smoke sting my eyes even worse. Please, stop. I can rewrite them, but I need those as reference. The ideas, the research, the quotes I gathered. Some of that took months to collect. Months you should have spent on more practical pursuits, she replied, reaching for my Northwestern essay. Like learning to cook something other than instant ramen. Or maybe figuring out how to do your own laundry without shrinking everything. Basic life skills that might actually matter when you're stuck in community college with all the other kids who aimed too high. The Northwestern essay was about my internship at the district attorney's office, where I'd spent last summer filing documents and observing court proceedings. I'd written about watching a public defender struggle to represent 12 different clients in a single morning, how the system was so overwhelmed that justice had become a luxury only the wealthy could afford. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. That essay had quotes from interviews I'd conducted with prosecutors, defense attorneys, and social workers. Statistics I'd gathered from court records and legal databases. Research that had taken me weeks to compile because I'd wanted to write something substantive. Something that showed I understood the legal field beyond just watching TV shows about lawyers. All of that work, all of those insights, all of those carefully documented sources were about to become nothing more than fuel for Patricia's rage. Fire. You broke into Dad's office, I said, the realization hitting me with fresh horror. You picked the lock on his filing cabinet. Your father keeps important documents secure, Patricia said, not even bothering to deny it. But he's always been too trusting. Too naive. Just like you, thinking you can waltz into Harvard because you wrote some pretty essays about your feelings. She was reaching for the last stack now. My backup copies, the ones I'd printed just in case something happened to my computer files. Essays for Duke, Vanderbilt, Emory, and the University of Virginia. My safety schools, the places I'd thought I had guaranteed admission based on my grades and test scores. I realized with growing panic that she wasn't just destroying my reach schools. She was eliminating every option, every backup plan, every possible path forward. Without these essays, I couldn't apply anywhere. The deadlines were in 2 weeks, and I'd never be able to recreate months of work in that short time. My phone was upstairs. I could call Dad, could try to stop this, but by the time he answered and understood what was happening, it would all be over. Patricia had calculated this perfectly, down to the timing and the isolation. The smoke alarm continued its shrill warning, but nobody was coming to help. Our neighbors were the kind of people who minded their own business, who assumed that anything happening at 4 a.m. in someone else's house was probably a false alarm or a kitchen accident they didn't need to investigate. I was completely alone with a woman who'd spent 3 years systematically dismantling everything that mattered to me, and now she was literally burning my future while I watched helplessly from across the room. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in. The brief silence between the fires crackling and the smoke alarms wailing. 3:52 a.m. In exactly 10 hours, I was supposed to submit my final application to Harvard Law School's early admission program. The application that was supposed to include all of the essays currently turning to ash in our fireplace, Patricia lifted. My personal statement, the 15-page masterpiece that had taken me 6 months to perfect. The essay that started with my earliest memory of my mother reading me bedtime stories from legal casebooks, making up voices for different judges and lawyers. The essay that traced my evolution from a confused 8-year-old who didn't understand why mommy wasn't coming home to a determined 17-year-old ready to fight for others who couldn't fight for themselves. This one's particularly pathetic, she said, scanning the first page in the firelight. Listen to this opening line. The law became my lullaby when I was 3 years old, as my mother's voice transformed complex legal arguments into bedtime stories that promised justice would always prevail. How nauseating. Hearing my carefully crafted words spoken in her mocking tone felt like watching someone desecrate a grave. Those opening lines had come to me during a particularly difficult night when I'd been struggling to find the right way to begin my personal statement. I'd remembered lying in my childhood bed, listening to Mom practice her arguments for the attorneys she worked for, how she'd turned dry legal briefs into epic tales of good versus evil. That memory had become the foundation for my entire essay. The thread that connected my past to my future, my loss to my purpose. Mrs. Rodriguez had called it a stunning example of personal narrative that demonstrates both vulnerability and strength. The Harvard admissions counselor who'd visited our school had specifically requested that students like me consider applying to their accelerated program, but now my opening lines sounded ridiculous when filtered through Patricia's contempt. Maybe. She was right. Maybe I was just a damaged kid trying to turn personal trauma into an admissions hook. Maybe my dreams were as naive and unrealistic as she'd always claimed. You see? Patricia said, noticing my expression. Even you can hear how pretentious it sounds when someone reads it out loud. Admissions officers aren't idiots, Sophia. They can spot manufactured emotion from a mile away. Manufactured emotion. As if the tears I'd shed while writing about my mother's unfulfilled dreams were fake. As if the late nights I'd spent researching civil rights cases were performances. As if my genuine desire to make the legal system more equitable was somehow calculated manipulation rather than authentic passion. The fire consumed another page as Patricia fed my personal statement into the flames piece by piece. Each sheet that disappeared took with it hours of careful revision, moments of breakthrough clarity, sentences I'd polished until they gleamed with exactly the right balance of personal insight and intellectual rigor. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez staying after school to help me brainstorm ideas. How she'd encouraged me to dig deeper into my motivations, to connect my personal experiences to larger social issues. How she'd celebrated with me when I'd finally found the perfect way to conclude my essay, with a promise to use my legal education to ensure that other children wouldn't grow up without mothers because drunk drivers faced inadequate consequences. All of that work, all of that growth, all of that careful construction of my academic identity was disappearing into smoke and ash. Patricia was destroying more than just my college applications. She was erasing the bridge I'd built between my painful past and my hopeful future. The smoke detector's battery was starting to die, its urgent beeping becoming more intermittent and pathetic. Soon even that warning would fade to silence, leaving just the sound of my dreams burning and Patricia's satisfied breathing as she watched my future disappear. I looked around the kitchen for something, anything that might help me save what remained. The fire extinguisher was in the pantry, but Patricia stood between me and that door. My laptop was upstairs, but even if I could reach it, I'd saved only early drafts of most essays. The final versions, the polished pieces that represented my best work, existed only in the papers she was systematically destroying. The kitchen island where I'd spent countless hours working on these applications was covered with the detritus of Patricia's destruction. Torn pieces of paper, scattered ashes that had floated back from the fireplace, the smell of burnt dreams settling over everything like a fog.my mother's photo smiled at me from the refrigerator, held up by a magnet I'd made in third grade art class. In the picture, she was 26 years old, wearing her paralegal certification ceremony dress, holding her diploma with pride and hope radiating from her face. She'd worked so hard for that degree, studying while I slept, taking night classes while working full-time, sacrificing her own comfort to build a better future for both of us. Now Patricia was destroying my chance to continue that legacy, to pick up where my mother's dreams had been cut short. The cruelty of the timing wasn't lost on me. October 15th, exactly 9 years and 2 months since the accident that had stolen my mother and derailed both our futures, Patricia must have planned this date deliberately, must have been waiting for this anniversary to deliver maximum emotional damage. She'd probably been thinking about this moment for weeks, maybe months, watching me work on my applications and planning the perfect way to destroy them when it would hurt the most. The last of my Northwestern essay curled into black ash as Patricia finally stepped back from the fireplace, brushing imaginary dust from her silk robe. She surveyed the destruction with the satisfaction of someone who'd just completed a particularly challenging home improvement project. The mantel clock chimed 4 times, each note echoing through our devastated kitchen like a funeral bell. "There," she said, clasping her hands together. "Much better. Now we can have an honest conversation about your future without all those silly papers cluttering up your thoughts." I stared at the fireplace where orange embers still glowed among the remains of 4 years of my academic life. Somewhere in that pile of ash were the quotes I'd gathered from Supreme Court justices about the importance of diverse perspectives in law. The statistics I'd compiled about wrongful convictions in death penalty cases. The interview transcripts from my conversations with public defenders who worked 18-hour days because the system was so overwhelmed. All of that research, all of those insights, all of those carefully documented sources that would have taken me months to recreate were now indistinguishable from the charred remains of grocery store receipts and junk mail. But Patricia didn't understand what she'd actually destroyed. She thought she'd burned paper and ink, dreams and aspirations. She had no idea that 3 weeks ago, I'd received a phone call that had changed everything. The call had come on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working my shift at Rosario's diner downtown. Mrs. Chen, the Harvard Law admissions counselor who'd visited our school back in September, had tracked down my work number after I'd missed her calls to my cell phone. "Miss Taylor," she'd said when I'd stepped outside during my break to take the call in private, "I have some rather unusual news to share with you." I'd assumed it was about scheduling conflicts or missing documentation. Maybe my SAT scores hadn't transferred properly, or one of my recommendation letters had gotten lost in the mail. I'd spent so many months worrying about every tiny detail of my application that I'd become paranoid about administrative errors. "We've completed our early review of your application materials," Mrs. Chen had continued, "and I'm delighted to inform you that the admissions committee has voted unanimously to offer you early acceptance into our accelerated undergraduate to law program." The phone had nearly slipped from my trembling fingers. Early acceptance to Harvard, with a full scholarship that covered not just tuition but room, board, and a living stipend for all 6 years of the combined program. "I'm sorry," I'd stammered, "could you repeat that?" Mrs. Chen had laughed, a warm sound that made me think of my third-grade teacher who'd first told me I was smart enough to dream big. "You've been accepted, Sophia. Your essay about restorative justice was passed around our entire department. Professor Williams, who heads our civil rights clinic, specifically requested that we fast-track your application." The conversation had lasted 20 more minutes as Mrs. Chen explained the details of the program. How I'd spend my first 2 years completing an intensive undergraduate curriculum designed specifically for pre-law students. How I'd begin actual law school courses in my 3rd year while finishing my bachelor's degree. How I'd graduate with both degrees by age 22, a full 2 years ahead of traditional students. "The only remaining requirement," she'd explained, "is that you complete your regular application by the October 15th deadline. It's a formality, really, but our system requires all students to submit the standard materials even when they've been pre-approved through our accelerated track. That's why tonight's destruction was so pointless." Patricia thought she was preventing me from attending Harvard, but the acceptance letter was already sitting in my email inbox. She thought she was crushing my dreams, but my dreams had already been validated by the most prestigious law school in the country. The formal application materials she'd just burned weren't requirements anymore. They were victory laps. They were my chance to polish and perfect essays that had already succeeded beyond my wildest expectations, but I couldn't tell her that. Not yet. Because watching Patricia gloat over what she thought was my complete devastation was giving me insight into exactly who she really was. For 3 years, I'd tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. I'd chalked up her constant criticism to adjustment difficulties, to the stress of blending families, to her own insecurities about fitting into our established household. Now I could see that her cruelty was deliberate and calculated. She hadn't lashed out in a moment of anger or frustration. She'd planned this destruction carefully, waiting for the perfect moment when I'd be most vulnerable and least able to fight back. "You know what your real problem is?" Patricia continued, settling into one of our kitchen bar stools like she was preparing to deliver a lecture. "You've been raised to believe that tragedy makes you special. Your father has coddled you since your mother died, treating you like some kind of precious wounded bird who needs constant protection and encouragement." She reached for the bottle of wine she'd apparently opened before beginning her arson project. The Pinot Grigio was already half empty, which explained the slight slur in her voice and the extra viciousness in her attacks. Patricia was always meaner when she'd been drinking, but alcohol also made her more honest about her true feelings. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. "I see a spoiled teenager who's been told she's brilliant and special for so long that she actually believes it. I see someone who's never faced real adversity, real challenge, real competition. Real adversity." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Did losing my mother at 8 years old not count as real adversity? Did watching my father struggle with depression for 2 years while I learned to cook dinner and manage our household finances not qualify as real challenge? Did working 25 hours a week while maintaining a perfect GPA and running 3 different volunteer programs not constitute real competition? But I was beginning to understand that Patricia's definition of adversity was very different from mine. To her, adversity meant not getting everything you wanted exactly when you wanted it. It meant having to work for recognition instead of having it handed to you because of who your parents were or how much money your family had. Patricia had grown up wealthy, the daughter of a real estate developer who'd built half the shopping centers in our county. She'd attended private schools where admission to good colleges was practically guaranteed if your family could afford the tuition. She'd married her first husband because he was connected to the right social circles, not because she loved him or shared his values. Her son Jason was the product of that privileged upbringing. He'd attended the same expensive private schools, had access to the same tutors and test prep courses, had every advantage money could buy. The fact that he'd squandered all of those opportunities wasn't a reflection of systemic unfairness. It was a consequence of never having to work for anything, never having to prove himself, never having to develop the resilience that came from overcoming genuine obstacles. Real competition, I said quietly, is maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working part-time to help pay for groceries. Real challenge is writing scholarship essays at midnight because that's the only free time you have after work and homework and volunteer commitments. Real adversity is losing your mother and still finding ways to honor her memory through achievement. Patricia's perfectly manicured hand tightened around her wine glass. "There you go again with the dead mother card. Do you honestly think that's going to work forever? Do you think every teacher, every employer, every person you meet for the rest of your life is going to feel sorry for you because something sad happened when you were a child? Something sad. As if my mother's death was equivalent to losing a pet or failing a test. As if the trauma that had reshaped my entire understanding of life, death, justice, and purpose was just a minor setback I should have gotten over by now. I don't want people to feel sorry for me," I said, my voice getting stronger. "I want them to recognize that surviving loss can make you stronger, more empathetic, more determined to fight for others who are suffering." "Surviving loss," Patricia repeated mockingly. "You were 8 years old. You didn't survive anything. You were a passive victim of circumstance, and you've been dining out on that victimhood ever since." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be dangerous. I had been a passive victim at 8 years old. I hadn't chosen to lose my mother, hadn't done anything heroic or brave to survive her death. For years afterward, I'd simply existed, going through the motions of childhood while trying to understand why the universe had taken away the most important person in my world. But somewhere around age 12, I'd made a conscious decision to transform my victimhood into purpose. I'd started volunteering at the legal aid clinic where my mother had planned to work during law school. I'd begun studying the cases she'd researched, understanding the legal principles she'd been passionate about, connecting her unfulfilled dreams to my own emerging sense of justice. That transformation hadn't been passive. It had required daily choices to turn pain into motivation, to channel grief into determination, to honor my mother's memory through action rather than wallowing in self-pity. "You're right," I said, surprising Patricia with my agreement. "I was a passive victim when I was 8. But I'm not 8 anymore. For the past 4 years, I've actively chosen to pursue the dreams my mother never got to achieve. I've worked for every grade, every opportunity, every recommendation letter. Nobody handed me anything because they felt sorry for me." Patricia's expression shifted slightly, as if she hadn't expected me to acknowledge any validity in her criticism. She'd been prepared for tears, for defensiveness, for the kind of emotional breakdown that would confirm her assessment of me as weak and overprivileged. Instead, I was standing straighter, speaking more clearly, finding strength in the very experiences she was trying to use against me. "You know what I think really bothers you?" I continued, emboldened by her momentary uncertainty. "It's not that I've had advantages you think I don't deserve. It's that I've succeeded despite facing obstacles your son has never had to overcome. Jason had every privilege, every opportunity, every safety net money could buy. And he still couldn't manage to graduate high school on time or hold a job for more than 3 months." The wine glass shattered against the kitchen wall, sending Pinot Grigio and glass shards across our tile floor. Patricia's face had gone from smug satisfaction to volcanic rage in the span of 10 seconds. "Don't you dare talk about my son," she hissed, stepping closer to me with her fists clenched. "Jason is going through a difficult phase. He's finding himself, exploring his options. Not everyone needs to follow the same rigid path to success." Finding himself. That was Patricia's euphemism for Jason's complete inability to function as an adult. In the 6 months he'd been living with us, he'd been fired from jobs at a grocery store, a gas station, and a movie theater. He'd wrecked his truck twice, both times while driving under the influence. He'd stolen prescription medication from Patricia's purse and sold it to buy video games, but Patricia defended every failure as evidence of Jason's creativity, his free spirit, his refusal to conform to society's narrow definitions of achievement. She'd convinced herself that his problems were everyone else's fault. His teachers had been too demanding. His employers had been unreasonable. His friends had been bad influences. The idea that her precious son might simply be lazy, entitled, and lacking in basic moral character was too threatening for her to consider. It was much easier to blame his failures on external circumstances while simultaneously attacking my successes as undeserved or manipulative. "You're right," I said. Again, my voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Not everyone follows the same path. Some people work hard and earn their achievements through merit and determination. Others expect success to be handed to them because of who their parents are. The difference is pretty obvious when you look at the results." Patricia lunged toward me, but I was ready for her this time. I stepped quickly around the kitchen island, putting the granite countertop between us. The broken glass crunched under her designer slippers as she tried to follow me, but the wine had made her movements clumsy and unpredictable. "You think you're so smart," she snarled, "but you have no idea what you've just lost. Without those essays, you can't apply anywhere. You've missed your chance at college completely. You'll be stuck here, watching Jason succeed while you work at that pathetic diner for the rest of your life." I almost smiled at the irony of her threat. Patricia thought she'd condemned me to a life of serving coffee and scrambled eggs to truckers and construction workers. She had no idea that Mrs. Chen's phone call had already guaranteed my escape from everything Patricia represented, but there was something else Patricia didn't understand about my job at Rosario's diner. She saw it as proof of my low status, evidence that I was already failing to live up to my supposed potential. She didn't realize that working there had taught me more about justice, fairness, and human dignity than any classroom ever could. At the diner, I served breakfast to janitors who worked 3 jobs to support their families. I listened to single mothers worry about paying for their children's school supplies. I watched elderly customers count exact change for coffee because their social security checks didn't stretch far enough to cover both food and medication. Those customers had taught me why the legal system mattered. Why someone needed to fight for fair wages and affordable healthcare and protection from predatory lending. They'd shown me that law wasn't just an intellectual exercise or a path to prestige. It was a tool for defending people who couldn't defend themselves. Patricia would never understand that perspective because she'd never worked a day in her life. She'd married money twice, lived off divorce settlements and alimony payments, treated employment as something other people did. Her idea of hardship was having to choose between designer handbags or having to wait an extra week for her hair appointment. "You know what the difference is between Jason and me?" I asked, still keeping the island between us as she swayed slightly from the wine and adrenaline. "When Jason fails, you make excuses for him. When I succeed, you try to tear me down. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of person you really are." The kitchen clock chimed again. 4:30 a.m. In exactly 9.5 hours, the Harvard Law Admissions Office would be expecting my formal application submission. The application that would include essays Patricia had just burned, recommendation letters she couldn't touch, and transcripts that existed in multiple copies at my school's guidance office. But I also had something Patricia could never destroy, no matter how many papers she burned or how many cruel words she spoke. I had the acceptance letter in my email inbox, the scholarship offer that would cover every penny of my education, and the promise of a future she couldn't touch. Patricia steadied herself against the kitchen counter, her breathing heavy from the combination of wine and rage. The broken glass at her feet glittered in the firelight like scattered diamonds, but her designer slippers were already stained with Pinot Grigio and what looked suspiciously like blood from a small cut on her ankle. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked the confident venom it had carried earlier. "Jason is incredibly talented. He's just selective about where he applies his energy." Selective. That was a new euphemism. Last month it had been creatively unfocused. Before that, academically non-traditional. Patricia had an endless supply of fancy phrases to avoid saying that her 21-year-old son was a complete failure who'd never held a job for more then 12 weeks or finished a semester of community college without dropping at least half his classes. But as I watched her struggle to maintain her balance, both physically and emotionally, I realized something crucial. Patricia's attack on my essays wasn't really about my college applications at all. It was about something much deeper, much more personal, and much more desperate. She was terrified that Jason's failures reflected poorly on her as a mother. Terrified that my successes made her son's incompetence more obvious by comparison. Most terrifyingly of all, she was afraid that Dad was beginning to see the truth about both of them. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Patricia hadn't just decided to destroy my essays tonight on a whim. She'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to eliminate me as competition for Dad's attention, pride, and financial resources. "When did you start planning this?" I asked, my voice eerily calm in the smoky kitchen. "When did you decide that burning my college applications was the solution to your problems?" Patricia's eyes darted away from mine, focusing instead on the dying embers in the fireplace. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You picked the lock on Dad's filing cabinet," I continued, taking a step closer. "That's not something you do on impulse. You had to research how to do it, maybe practice on other locks. You had to wait until he was out of town for multiple days. You even timed it for the anniversary of my mother's death, didn't you?" The accusation hung in the air between us like smoke. Patricia's face went completely white, confirming what I'd suspected. This wasn't random cruelty or drunken destructiveness. This was psychological warfare, planned and executed with military precision. "The anniversary is just a coincidence," she stammered, but her voice betrayed her. "I didn't even remember, you remembered." I was completely certain now. "You've been waiting for this date specifically because you knew it would hurt the most. You wanted me to associate the worst day of my life with losing my future too." Patricia's silk robe fluttered as she wrapped it more tightly around herself, suddenly looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked actually vulnerable instead of predatory. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she whispered. "Your father talks about you constantly. Your grades, your achievements, your bright future. Do you know what it's like to watch your own child struggle while listening to endless praise for someone else's kid?" There it was. The truth she'd been hiding behind 3 years of subtle sabotage and calculated cruelty. Patricia wasn't evil. Exactly. She was just a desperate mother watching her son fail while her stepdaughter succeeded, and she'd convinced herself that my achievements were somehow causing Jason's problems. "So you decided to level the playing field," I said. "If you couldn't make Jason successful, you'd make sure I failed instead." "That's not," Patricia started, then stopped. Her shoulders sagged as if admitting the truth had physically deflated. Jason tries so hard. He really does. But everything comes so easily to you. The perfect grades, the recommendations, the scholarships. It's not fair. Not fair." The phrase echoed ironically through the destroyed kitchen. Patricia thought it was unfair that I'd earned recognition through 4 years of exhausting work while her son expected rewards without effort. She thought it was unfair that consequences existed for Jason's choices while my choices had led to opportunities, but she'd missed the most important unfairness of all. It wasn't fair that I'd lost my mother at 8 years old. It wasn't fair that I'd had to grow up faster than other kids, taking care of household responsibilities while Dad grieved. It wasn't fair that I'd worked part-time jobs since I was old. Enough to get a work permit, not for spending money but to help cover our basic expenses. The difference was that I'd learned to transform unfairness into motivation, while Patricia and Jason had learned to use it as an excuse for mediocrity. "You want to know what's really not fair?" I asked, stepping over the broken glass to get closer to her. "What's not fair is that you've spent 3 years undermining my confidence, criticizing my goals, and making me question whether I deserved any of the opportunities I'd earned." Patricia flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I never, you absolutely did." The words poured out of me now, 3 years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. "You told my guidance counselor that I was overly ambitious and needed to set more realistic expectations. You canceled my meeting with the Harvard recruiter without telling me, claiming you were protecting me from disappointment. You've spent 3 years systematically trying to convince everyone, including me, that I wasn't good enough for my own dreams." Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Patricia's face crumpled as I listed the various ways she'd tried to sabotage my academic career. The helpful suggestions that I consider trade school instead of college. The realistic conversations about how competitive admissions had become. The practical advice about choosing schools closer to home so I could continue helping with household expenses, but the most insidious part of her campaign had been the way she'd tried to turn Dad against my ambitions. The subtle comments about how much my extracurricular activities cost. The worried observations about how much stress I was putting myself under. The gentle suggestions that maybe I should focus more on being a normal teenager instead of pushing myself so hard academically. You almost succeeded, I admitted, my voice breaking slightly. There were nights when I lay in bed wondering if you were right. If I was delusional to think I could get into Harvard. If I was being selfish to pursue expensive dreams when Jason needed help too. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of remorse or self-pity. I just wanted what was best for both of you, she whispered. No, I said firmly. You wanted what was easiest for you. You wanted to be the mother of the successful kid without doing any of the work to help your actual kid succeed. You thought, if you could tear me down far enough, Jason would look better by comparison. The kitchen clock chimed 5 a.m., and pale dawn light began filtering through our windows. In exactly 9 hours, I was supposed to submit my Harvard application. The application. That would be complete except for the essays Patricia had just destroyed. The essays that had already served their purpose by earning me early acceptance, but which Patricia believed were my only path to college. I pulled my phone from my pajama pants pocket and opened my email app. Patricia watched suspiciously as I scrolled through my messages, probably assuming I was calling Dad or the police or someone else who might stop her from completing her mission. Instead, I found what I was looking for. The email from Mrs. Chen at Harvard Law Admissions. The message that had arrived 3 weeks ago and changed everything. The acceptance letter that made Patricia's entire night of destruction completely pointless. You want to know what's really not fair? I asked, holding up my phone so she could see the Harvard logo at the top of the email. What's not fair is that you spent months planning this elaborate sabotage, and it was already too late. Patricia squinted at the screen, her whine blurred. Vision struggling to focus on the small text. As comprehension dawned, her face went through a fascinating series of expressions. Confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally, devastating realization. That's impossible, she breathed. You haven't even submitted your application yet. I was accepted 3 weeks ago, I said, unable to keep the triumph out of my voice. Early admission to their accelerated undergraduate to law program. Full scholarship. The essays you just burned were for the formal application, which is basically a formality at this point. Patricia grabbed my phone with shaking hands, reading the email more carefully. Her lips moved silently as she processed Mrs. Chen's words. About unanimous committee approval, about Professor Williams requesting my expedited acceptance, about the full funding package that would cover 6 years of education. This can't be real, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. They don't just accept people without complete applications. They do when your essay about restorative justice gets passed around the entire admissions department, I replied. They do when the head of their civil rights clinic specifically requests your expedited review. They do when you're exactly the kind of student they've been hoping to attract. The phone slipped from Patricia's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the kitchen tile. She stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time, as if all her assumptions about my capabilities and prospects had just been shattered beyond repair. So burning my essays accomplished exactly nothing, I continued. Except revealing who you really are. And giving me a perfect story to tell Mrs. Chen when she calls tomorrow to check on my application status. You can't tell them about this, Patricia said, panic creeping into her voice. You can't let them know that your family situation is complicated. Complicated. Another euphemism. As if having a stepmother who committed arson to prevent her stepdaughter's success was just a minor family quirk that admissions officers might find concerning. Actually, I said, I think Harvard would be very interested to know about this. Mrs. Chen specifically mentioned that they value students who've overcome significant obstacles. Having a family member try to destroy my future probably qualifies as a significant obstacle, don't you think? The color drained completely from Patricia's face. Sophia, please. I made a mistake. I was drunk, I was upset about Jason, I wasn't thinking clearly. But if you tell them about this, it could affect your father's reputation. His law practice, his clients, his standing in the community. There it was. The threat I'd been waiting for. Patricia was finally playing her last card, the one she'd been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. She was threatening to damage Dad's career if I exposed her behavior. Dad's law practice was everything to him. He'd built it from nothing. After Mom died, working 18-hour days to establish himself as one of the most respected family law attorneys in the state. His reputation for integrity and professionalism was spotless, and his client list included some of the most prominent families in our area. A scandal involving his wife attempting to sabotage his daughter's college prospects would indeed damage that reputation. Other attorneys might question his judgment. Clients might wonder about his ability to manage his own family if he couldn't control his spouse. The legal community was small and gossipy, and this kind of story would spread quickly, but Patricia had made a crucial miscalculation. She assumed I would prioritize Dad's career over my own integrity. She thought I would stay silent to protect the family name, even if it meant allowing her to escape consequences for her actions. She'd forgotten that I'd learned my moral compass from my mother, who'd taught me that justice mattered more than convenience. She'd forgotten that Dad himself had raised me to believe that truth was more important than reputation. Most importantly, she'd forgotten that keeping this secret would mean allowing her to continue living in our house, continuing to undermine my relationship with Dad, continuing to poison our family dynamic with her jealousy and resentment. "You're right," I said, watching hope flicker in her eyes. "This could damage Dad's reputation." Patricia exhaled in relief, assuming I was agreeing to her terms. "That's why you're going to tell him yourself when he gets home Sunday," I continued. "You're going to explain exactly what you did and why you did it. And then you're going to pack your things and leave." The hope in Patricia's eyes died instantly. "I can't do that. I won't do that. This is my home too." "This was never your home," I said quietly. "This was the house where Dad and I built a new life after Mom died. You were a guest who overstayed her welcome and forgot how to behave appropriately." Patricia's face twisted with rage again, but this time it was different. This was the rage of someone who'd been outmaneuvered, who'd played their best card and watched it fail spectacularly. "You think you're so smart," she hissed. "But what happens when I tell your father that you threatened me? That you blackmailed me into leaving? Do you think he'll choose his precious daughter over his wife?" It was a good question, actually. Dad loved me unconditionally, but he'd also made legal and financial commitments to Patricia when he'd married her. Divorce would be expensive and complicated, especially if Patricia decided to fight it. She could claim emotional distress, could demand alimony, could make Dad's life miserable for years, but Patricia had forgotten something crucial about my father. He was a family law attorney who'd spent 15 years helping people escape toxic relationships. He understood better than most people how manipulative spouses operated, how they used emotional terrorism to maintain control, how they escalated their behavior when their victims tried to establish boundaries. Dad had seen this exact pattern dozens of times in his professional life. He'd recognized Patricia's tactics immediately, especially when I showed him the evidence of her calculated destruction. The smoke alarm finally died completely, its battery depleted from hours of warning about a fire nobody had bothered to extinguish. The sudden silence felt ominous, as if the house itself was holding its breath while Patricia and I faced off across the debris of her failed sabotage attempt. But I had one more revelation that would ensure Patricia understood exactly how completely she'd miscalculated. One final piece of information that would demonstrate just how futile her entire campaign against me had been. "There's one more thing you should know," I said, pulling up another email on my phone. "About why your plan was doomed from the beginning." I scrolled through my phone until I found the email I was looking for. It was from my boss at Rosario's Diner, Maria Santos, sent just yesterday afternoon. The timestamp showed 3:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours and 13 minutes before Patricia had begun her arson spree. "This is from Maria," I said, holding up the phone. "She wanted to give me a heads up about something interesting that happened at the diner yesterday morning." Patricia's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She couldn't imagine how my minimum wage job at a roadside diner could possibly be relevant to our current confrontation. In her worldview, places like Rosario's were where people like me belonged, not sources of information that could threaten people like her. "Maria noticed someone sitting in the corner booth for 3 hours, I continued, nursing a single cup of coffee and watching the kitchen through the pass-through window. "Someone who seemed very interested in my work schedule, asking the other waitresses when I usually worked, whether I was a good employee, whether I seemed stressed about anything." The color began draining from Patricia's face as she realized where this was heading. Someone with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive jewelry who paid for her coffee with a credit card. Someone who left exactly the kind of generous tip that people leave when they're trying to make a good impression. Patricia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. She'd been so careful with her other surveillance, so subtle with her questions and observations. But she'd made the classic mistake of thinking that working-class people were invisible, that Maria and the other waitresses wouldn't notice or remember a woman who clearly didn't belong in their world. "The funny thing is," I said, reading from Maria's email, "this woman seemed particularly interested in my college plans. She asked Linda if I ever talked about where I was applying, whether I seemed confident about getting in, whether I had backup plans if things didn't work out. I wanted to understand." Patricia stammered, but she couldn't finish the sentence. "There was no innocent explanation for surveilling your stepdaughter's workplace, pumping her coworkers for information, gathering intelligence about her emotional state and future plans. You wanted to understand what?" I asked. Whether I had any indication that Harvard was already interested in me. Whether I seemed worried about my applications. Whether you could time your sabotage for maximum psychological impact. Patricia backed against the kitchen counter, trapped between my accusations and the evidence of her own actions. The broken wine glass crunched under her slippers as she shifted her weight, and I noticed the small cut on her ankle was bleeding more steadily now, leaving dark drops on our white tile floor. Maria also mentioned something else, I continued, scrolling to another part of the email. About how this woman asked very specific questions about my family situation. Whether my father seemed proud of me. Whether I ever mentioned any family problems or stress at home. Whether I seemed like the kind of girl who had a strong support system. Those questions revealed the true depth of Patricia's planning. She hadn't just been gathering information about my college prospects. She'd been conducting a comprehensive psychological assessment, trying to determine exactly how much damage she could inflict and whether I had the emotional resources to recover from her attack. You've been planning this for months, I said, the full scope of her manipulation finally becoming clear. The casual comments about college being overrated. The suggestions that I should consider schools closer to home. The way you've been undermining my confidence with Dad. This wasn't a sudden decision. This was a campaign. Patricia's legs seemed to give out suddenly, and she slid down the kitchen cabinet until she was sitting on the floor among the wine and glass fragments. Her silk robe spread around her like the wings of a fallen angel, dark stains seeping through the expensive fabric. You don't understand the pressure, she whispered, but her voice lacked the venom it had carried earlier. Jason's father calls every week, asking why his son isn't succeeding. My own parents ask why I can't motivate my child the way David motivated his. Everyone compares us constantly. The admission hung in the air between us like a confession. Patricia wasn't just jealous of my achievements. She was humiliated by the constant comparisons between her parenting and Dad's, between her son's failures and my successes. Every teacher conference, every family gathering, every casual conversation with neighbors became an indictment of her effectiveness as a mother. So you decided the solution was to destroy my achievements instead of helping Jason create his own, I said. Instead of addressing his drinking problem, his work ethic, his complete lack of ambition, you focused all your energy on tearing me down. That's not true, Patricia protested, but her voice was barely audible. I tried to help Jason. I got him tutors, therapists, life coaches. I pulled strings to get him into programs, bought him every self-help book, sent him to motivational seminars. Nothing worked. The list of interventions was actually impressive in its scope and expense. Patricia had spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to transform Jason into the kind of son she could be proud of. She'd exhausted every resource, every connection, every possible solution that money could buy, but she'd missed the most fundamental problem. Jason didn't want to change. He was perfectly content living in our basement, playing video games, collecting unemployment benefits, and letting Mommy make excuses for his failures. Why would he put effort into improving his life when Patricia was willing to provide everything he needed without requiring any reciprocal responsibility? You know what the difference is between helping someone and enabling them? I asked. When you help someone, you give them tools and support while they do the hard work themselves. When you enable someone, you remove all consequences from their choices and then wonder why they never learn to make better decisions. Patricia flinched as if I'd diagnosed a terminal illness. She'd spent 3 years watching Jason drift from one failure to another while making increasingly elaborate excuses for his behavior. She'd convinced herself that his problems were temporary setbacks, that with enough support and patience he'd eventually find his direction, but somewhere deep down, she knew the truth. Jason wasn't going through a phase or struggling with temporary obstacles. He was a 21-year-old man who'd learned that failure was more comfortable than effort, that disappointment was more tolerable than the risk of trying and falling short of expectations. Jason could still turn his life around, I continued, but not while you're protecting him from every consequence and making his problems everyone else's fault. And definitely not while you're trying to tear down other people's kids to make him look better by comparison. The kitchen clock chimed 5:30 a.m., and full daylight was beginning to stream through our windows. In exactly 8.5 hours, I was supposed to submit my Harvard application. The application that was already guaranteed acceptance, that would fulfill the formal requirements for a scholarship that had already been awarded, that would complete a process Patricia had tried desperately to sabotage. That I heard a car door slam in our driveway, followed by the sound of footsteps on our front porch. Patricia and I both froze, listening to the familiar jingle of keys and the creak of our front door opening. Sophia? Patricia? Is everything okay? I could smell smoke from the street. Dad's voice echoed through the house, concerned and slightly panicked. He wasn't supposed to be home until Sunday afternoon. His Chicago case must have settled early, or maybe he'd caught a red-eye flight to surprise us. Patricia's eyes widened with terror as she realized her timeline had just collapsed. She'd planned to have the entire weekend to clean up the evidence, to dispose of the ashes, to craft a plausible story about why my college essays had mysteriously vanished. Now Dad was here, in our kitchen, seeing the destruction firsthand. "We're in the kitchen, Dad," I called out, my voice steady despite the chaos surrounding us. "We need to talk." Patricia struggled to her feet, glass fragments falling from her robe as she tried to compose herself. But there was no way to hide what had happened. The fireplace still smoldered with the remains of my essays. Broken wine glass covered the floor. The smell of burnt paper hung heavy in the air. Patricia's bleeding ankle left a trail of evidence. Across the white tiles, Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his travel clothes, carry-on bag still in his hand. His tired eyes took in the scene with the analytical precision of someone who'd spent 15 years investigating domestic disputes. The overturned wine bottle. The ashes in the fireplace. Patricia's disheveled appearance. My pajamas and obvious emotional distress. "What happened here?" he asked quietly, but his voice carried the same tone he used in court when he knew opposing counsel was about to lie to him. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, probably to deliver some carefully crafted explanation about accidents and misunderstandings. But I spoke first, my voice clear and strong in the morning light. "Patricia burned my college essays," I said simply. "All of them. While you were in Chicago, she broke into your filing cabinet, stole my application materials, and fed them into the fireplace piece by piece." Dad's expression didn't change, but I saw his knuckles whiten as his grip tightened on his bag handle. He set it down slowly, never taking his eyes off Patricia's face. "Is that true?" he asked her, his voice dangerously calm. "David, I can explain," Patricia began, but he held up his hand to stop her. "It's a yes or no question, Patricia. Did you deliberately destroy Sophia's college application materials?" The directness of the question, the lawyer's precision of his language, seemed to strip away Patricia's remaining defenses. She couldn't hedge or deflect or minimize when faced with such stark clarity. "Yes," she whispered. "But you have to understand." "I understand perfectly," Dad said, his voice like ice. "You committed a felony. Destruction of property, interference with educational opportunities, possibly fraud if you tried to impersonate Sophia with any institutions. You deliberately sabotaged your stepdaughter's future while I was out of town." The legal terminology seemed to snap Patricia out of her emotional spiral. "It's not a felony," she protested. "They're just papers. College essays. She can rewrite them." "Those papers represented months of work," Dad replied. "They had monetary value in terms of scholarship opportunities and admission prospects. Destroying them was criminal destruction of property at minimum. And since you're not her legal guardian, and have no authority over her educational decisions, this could also constitute harassment, stalking, and interference with a minor's civil rights." I watched Patricia's face as Dad systematically dismantled her assumption that her actions were merely domestic drama rather than actual crimes. She'd convinced herself that burning my essays was a family matter, a parenting decision, an expression of legitimate concern about my choices. She'd never considered that what she'd done was illegal. That someone could press charges, file complaints, seek legal remedies for her behavior. In her worldview, stepmothers had unlimited authority to shape their stepchildren's lives, regardless of the methods they used or the damage they caused. "I was trying to protect her," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "College is so expensive, so competitive. I thought if she focused on more realistic options." "You thought you had the right to make that decision for her," Dad interrupted. "Without consulting me, without consulting her guidance counselor, without any knowledge of her actual prospects or capabilities. You took it upon yourself to determine my daughter's future." "My daughter. Not our daughter, not Sophia, but my daughter." The possessive pronoun carried weight in Dad's legal vocabulary, drawing clear lines of authority and responsibility that excluded Patricia entirely. "She's not just your daughter anymore," Patricia said, desperation creeping into her voice. "When we got married, I became her stepmother. That gives me rights, responsibilities. I had to consider what was best for our whole family, including Jason. Being a stepmother gives you exactly zero legal rights over my daughter's educational decisions," Dad replied coldly. "And it certainly doesn't give you the right to commit crimes against her property or her future." The word crimes hung in the air like a judgment. Patricia had spent the night thinking of herself as a concerned parent making tough decisions. Now she was being forced to confront the reality that she was a criminal who deliberately damaged a minor's educational prospects. "But what about Jason?" she asked, playing her last card. "What about his needs, his opportunities? Everything in this house revolves around Sophia's achievements. When do we consider what's fair for my son? Dad's expression shifted slightly, and for a moment I thought Patricia might have found a vulnerable spot. Dad had always tried to be fair to Jason, to treat him like family despite his obvious problems. Maybe the appeal to parental equity would soften his resolve. Instead, Dad's voice became even colder. Jason is 21 years old, he said. He's had every opportunity, every advantage, every form of support money can buy. The fact that he's chosen to waste those opportunities doesn't justify sabotaging a minor child's education. If you wanted to help Jason succeed, you should have focused on teaching him responsibility, work ethic, and accountability. Instead, you taught him that his failures are always someone else's fault. The assessment was brutal in its accuracy. Dad had been watching Jason's behavior for 6 months, had seen the entitled attitude, the complete lack of motivation, the expectation that success should be handed to him without effort. He'd also been watching Patricia make excuses, remove consequences, and blame external factors for her son's obvious character defects. You're not the first parent I've seen who thought destroying other people's children would somehow elevate their own, Dad continued. In family court, we call it crab bucket mentality. Instead of helping your child climb higher, you try to pull everyone else down to their level. Patricia's face crumpled as the full weight of Dad's professional and personal judgment settled over her. She'd gambled everything on the belief that Dad would choose marital loyalty over parental duty. She'd assumed that 3 years of marriage created obligations that would override his commitment to my future. She'd miscalculated catastrophically. I want you out of this house by noon, Dad said quietly. Pack whatever you can carry today. We'll arrange for the rest of your belongings to be collected later, once I've documented everything for the divorce proceedings. Divorce? Patricia's voice cracked on the word. David, please. I made a mistake. I was drunk, I was jealous, I wasn't thinking clearly. But we can work through this. Marriage counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. There's no working through felony destruction of property, Dad replied. There's no marriage counseling for someone who commits crimes against my child. There's no therapy that can fix the kind of person who would burn a teenager's college essays out of spite and jealousy. I watched Patricia's world collapse in real time as she realized that her carefully planned sabotage had destroyed her own life instead of mine. She'd thrown away her marriage, her home, her financial security, all in service of a plan that had been doomed from the beginning. What about Jason? She whispered. Where will we go? What will we do? That's no longer my problem, Dad said. You should have considered those questions before you decided to wage war against my daughter's future. The finality in his voice seemed to break something inside Patricia. She began crying then, not the angry tears of earlier but the desperate sobs of someone who'd lost everything and finally understood that it was entirely her own fault. Patricia's sobs echoed through the kitchen as Dad moved with the methodical precision of someone who'd handled hundreds of domestic crises. He pulled out his phone and began taking photographs of the evidence. The smoldering fireplace filled with essay ashes. The broken wine glass scattered across the floor. Patricia's bloody footprints tracking through the destruction she'd created. This is for the police report, he said matter-of-factly as the camera clicked. And for the divorce proceedings. Property destruction, harassment, possibly stalking given the surveillance at Sophia's workplace. I watched Patricia's face as she realized Dad wasn't just angry. He was building a legal case against her with the same professional thoroughness he brought to his client work. Every photograph, every documentation, every witness statement would become evidence in multiple proceedings that would follow her for years. David, please, she whispered between sobs. I know I made a terrible mistake, but involving the police will ruin everything. My career, my reputation, my ability to find housing. Please don't destroy my life over one night of poor judgment. Dad paused in his documentation to look at her directly. You destroyed my daughter's college essays while I was out of town, Patricia. You committed premeditated arson of materials worth thousands of dollars in potential scholarship money. You're lucky I'm not calling the fire department about the unlawful burning you conducted in a residential fireplace. The mention of fire department regulations seemed to drain the last bit of fight from Patricia. She hadn't considered that burning paper in a residential fireplace might violate municipal codes, especially given the quantity of material she'd destroyed and the obvious intent to conceal evidence. My phone buzzed with a text message. Then another. Then a whole series of notifications that made me check the screen with growing amazement. The first message was from Mrs. Rodriguez, my English teacher. Sophia, I just got the most wonderful call from Harvard. They wanted to verify some details about your application. I'm so proud of you. The second was from Mr. Thompson, my debate coach. Congratulations on Harvard. Mrs. Chen called to ask about your leadership experience. I may have gushed for 20 minutes about your championship performance. The third was from Janet Morrison, our school guidance counselor. Harvard called this morning requesting additional character references. I've never been so excited to write a supplemental recommendation. I scrolled through message after message. From teachers, volunteer coordinators, even my supervisor at the legal aid clinic. Apparently, Mrs. Chen had spent her Friday morning making verification calls to everyone who'd written recommendations for my application. Standard procedure for accelerated admissions, but it meant that half my school already knew about my acceptance. Dad, I said, holding up my phone. Harvard's been calling my teachers all morning to verify my application details. Everyone knows I got in. Dad's expression shifted from grim determination to genuine surprise. You got into Harvard? The question hung in the air as I realized I'd never actually told him about Mrs. Chen's call 3 weeks ago. I'd been so focused on keeping the secret from Patricia, so determined to protect the news until my formal application was complete, that I'd never shared the most important moment of my academic life with the person who'd supported me through everything. I got in 3 weeks ago, I said, my voice trembling with emotion I'd been suppressing since the phone call. Early admission to their accelerated program. Full scholarship for 6 years. They fast-tracked my application because of my essay on restorative justice. Dad dropped his phone onto the kitchen counter and stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pride, amazement, relief, and something that looked like vindication all mixed together on his tired face. Harvard Law School accepted you, he said slowly, as if testing the words to make sure they were real. With a full scholarship. The essay Patricia burned last night? I said, looking at the cold ashes in our fireplace. It was just for the formal application. I'm already in. Everything she destroyed was essentially meaningless. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Patricia had spent months planning her sabotage, had waited for the perfect moment of maximum cruelty, had destroyed years of my work in a calculated act of psychological warfare. And all of it had been completely pointless because my acceptance was already secured. Dad walked over to me and pulled me into the kind of hug he used to give when I was little and had skinned my knee or lost a friend. The kind of hug that said everything would be okay, that he was proud of me, that I was safe and loved and supported no matter what challenges we faced. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice muffled against my hair. I wanted to surprise you when the formal application was complete, I admitted. And I was afraid Patricia would find out and try to sabotage it somehow. Which, as it turns out, was a pretty reasonable fear. We both looked at Patricia, who was still sitting on the floor among the debris of her failed scheme. She'd stopped crying and was staring at us with a mixture of shock and something that might have been admiration for the completeness of her own defeat. So this was all for nothing, she said quietly. The planning, the surveillance, the waiting for the perfect moment. None of it mattered. Worse than nothing, Dad corrected. If you'd left Sophia alone, you'd still have a home, a marriage, and a stepfamily. Instead, you've lost everything while accomplishing absolutely nothing. My phone rang with an unknown Massachusetts number. I looked at Dad, who nodded encouragingly, then answered on speaker. Miss Taylor? This is Mrs. Chen from Harvard Law Admissions. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Good morning, Mrs. Chen. I've been making verification calls for your formal application, and I have to say, the responses have been extraordinary. Your teachers couldn't stop talking about your character, your work ethic, your leadership abilities. Mr. Thompson actually said, and I quote, Sophia Taylor is the most naturally gifted advocate I've seen in 20 years of coaching debate. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as Dad beamed with pride beside me. Even Patricia was listening intently, perhaps finally understanding exactly what she'd tried to destroy. But I'm calling about something else, Mrs. Chen continued. We've had an unusual request from Professor Williams, who heads our civil rights clinic. He'd like to meet with you personally before the semester begins. Apparently, your essay on restorative justice has sparked some interesting conversations in our department about expanding our community outreach programs. That sounds amazing, I managed to say. Professor Williams is particularly interested in your work with domestic violence survivors at the legal aid clinic. He thinks your perspective could be valuable in developing new approaches to family law that prioritize healing alongside justice. I glanced at Patricia, who was watching this conversation with growing realization that she'd tried to prevent exactly the kind of opportunity most students could only dream about. Professor Williams wasn't just offering to meet with me. He was suggesting that my ideas might influence Harvard's actual programs and policies. There's one more thing, Mrs. Chen said. We understand that you've been working part-time to help support your family. Professor Williams has arranged for you to Receive a paid research assistant position that will begin immediately upon enrollment. It's unusual for first-year students, but your background and insights make you uniquely qualified. Dad's eyes widened as he processed what this meant. Not only was I getting into Harvard with a full scholarship, but I was being offered paid work that would provide additional financial security and professional experience from day one. Mrs. Chen, I said, I can't thank you enough for these opportunities. Don't thank me, Miss Taylor. Thank your exceptional work and character. We'll see you in Cambridge this fall. After hanging up, the kitchen fell silent except for the gentle crackling of dying embers in the fireplace. Dad was looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time, recognizing that his daughter had somehow transformed into a young woman capable of impressing Harvard professors and earning recognition that most students worked their entire careers to achieve. I'm so proud of you, he said quietly. Not just for Harvard, but for how you've handled all of this. The maturity, the grace, the way you've risen above everything Patricia put you through. I had a good teacher, I said, squeezing his hand. You showed me that integrity matters more than convenience, that truth is more important than keeping the peace. Patricia struggled to her feet, using the kitchen counter for support. Her ankle had stopped bleeding, but her designer robe was ruined beyond repair, stained with wine and ash and the evidence of her own destructive choices. I should go pack, she said quietly. Jason will be wondering what happened when he wakes up. Patricia, Dad said, his voice softer than it had been since he'd arrived home. I want you to understand something. This isn't happening because I don't care about you or because I wanted our marriage to fail. This is happening because you chose to attack my child. There are lines that can't be uncrossed, boundaries that can't be violated. Patricia nodded slowly, seeming to finally grasp the magnitude of what she'd done. I know, she whispered. I wanted so badly for Jason to succeed. And watching Sophia achieve everything so easily made it hurt worse. Nothing about Sophia's success has been easy, Dad replied. She's worked harder than any teenager should have to work. She's overcome obstacles that would have broken most adults. The difference is that she transformed her challenges into motivation instead of using them as excuses. I watched Patricia's face as Dad's words sank in. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed to be genuinely hearing feedback about her behavior instead of immediately deflecting or making excuses. I don't know how to help Jason, she admitted. I've tried everything I can think of, spent every resource I have. Nothing works. Maybe because you've been trying to fix the wrong problem, I said gently. Jason doesn't need more opportunities or resources or safety nets. He needs to face consequences for his choices. He needs to learn that failure has costs and success requires effort. Patricia looked at me with something that might have been respect. You really think he could still turn things around? I think everyone can change if they want to badly enough, I said. But they have to want it more than they want to stay comfortable in their failures. Dad checked his watch and sighed. Patricia, I'll help you carry your bags to your car, but then I need you to leave. Sophia and I have some celebrating to do, and we need to call her grandmother to share the good news. Grandma Helen, my mother's mother, who'd never stopped believing that I would honor my mother's memory through achievement. Who'd worked extra shifts as a nurse to help pay for my SAT prep classes. Who'd driven 6 hours to attend every debate tournament, every academic award ceremony. Every moment of recognition that Patricia had tried to diminish. As Patricia headed upstairs to pack, Dad turned to me with tears in his eyes. Your mother would be so proud, he said. She always knew you'd do something extraordinary with your life. We did it together, I replied. All three of us. Mom gave me the dream, you gave me the support to chase it, and I did the work to make it real. Outside, I could hear Patricia moving around upstairs, gathering the pieces of the life she'd thrown away in a moment of jealous rage. But inside our kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of her failed sabotage, Dad and I were planning my future at Harvard Law School and everything that would come after. The sound of Patricia's footsteps on the stairs grew fainter as she retreated to pack her belongings. Dad and I stood in our destroyed kitchen, but somehow the space felt lighter than it had in 3 years. The smoke had finally cleared, both literally and metaphorically, revealing the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of manipulation and false harmony. We should call Grandma Helen, Dad said, pulling out his phone. She deserves to hear this news directly from you. I nodded, thinking about my maternal grandmother who'd been my fiercest advocate since the day my mother died. Grandma Helen had never liked Patricia, had seen through her performance of concerned stepmother from their very first meeting. She'd been the one to warn Dad that Patricia's interest in our family seemed more calculated than genuine. Dad dialed her number and put the phone on speaker. Grandma Helen answered on the first ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. David? Is everything all right? You don't usually call this early. Everything's more than all right, Helen, Dad said, his voice warm with pride. Sophia has some news to share with you. Grandma, I said, stepping closer to the phone, I got into Harvard Law School. Full scholarship. They accepted me into their accelerated program. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard a sound I recognized from childhood, Grandma Helen's happy tears, the ones she'd cried at my mother's graduation, at my parents' wedding, at every major milestone that marked our family's progress toward something better. Oh, sweetheart. She finally managed. Oh, my brilliant girl. Your mother, she would be dancing around her room right now. She always said you'd surpass every dream she ever had. The emotion in her voice broke something open in my chest. For 3 years, Patricia had made me feel guilty for pursuing ambitious goals, as if honoring my mother's memory was somehow selfish or unrealistic. Hearing Grandma Helen's pure joy reminded me that my dreams weren't burdens to apologize for, they were gifts to celebrate. There's more, Dad said. Professor Williams wants to meet with her personally. They're offering her a paid research position starting immediately. Sophia's ideas about restorative justice have impressed the entire department. A paid position? Grandma Helen's voice rose with excitement. At Harvard Law School? As an undergraduate? Apparently my essay on family law reform caught their attention, I explained. Professor Williams thinks my perspective could help develop new approaches to domestic violence cases. Family law reform, Grandma Helen repeated slowly. Your mother's specialty. She spent her last year as a paralegal working on domestic violence cases, trying to find ways to help survivors navigate the legal system more safely. I hadn't known that detail about my mother's work. Dad had always spoken generally about her legal interests, but he'd never mentioned her specific focus on domestic violence advocacy. The parallel between her unfulfilled work and my emerging interests felt like more than coincidence. She kept a notebook, Grandma Helen continued, filled with ideas about how the courts could better protect families escaping abuse. She was planning to make it her law school thesis project. Do you still have it? I asked, my heart racing. Of course, sweetheart. It's in the box of her things I've been saving for you. I always planned to give it to you when you started law school, but I never imagined it would happen this soon. The idea that my mother's research and insights might still exist, might be something I could build upon at Harvard, felt like a gift from beyond the grave. Her dreams hadn't died with her, they'd been waiting patiently for me to grow strong enough to carry them forward. I'll drive over with it this afternoon, Grandma Helen said. We need to celebrate properly. I'm making your mother's favorite cake, the one she always requested for special occasions. After we hung up, Dad and I looked at each other across our demolished kitchen. The physical destruction Patricia had caused seemed almost insignificant compared to the emotional clarity that had emerged from the wreckage. I never told you about your mother's notebook because I thought it might make her death feel more tragic, Dad said quietly. All those unfinished plans, all that research that would never become reality. But now it doesn't feel tragic at all, I finished. It feels like she left me a roadmap. We heard Patricia's footsteps on the stairs again, this time accompanied by the sound of rolling luggage. She appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying 2 suitcases and looking smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what she'd lost. I've packed what I need for now, she said, avoiding our eyes. I'll arrange to collect the rest later, when it's convenient for you. Dad nodded formally. My attorney will contact you about the divorce proceedings and property division. Given the circumstances, I don't anticipate this being a lengthy process. Patricia flinched at the clinical tone, the complete absence of the warmth that had characterized their relationship for 3 years. But she'd forfeited any claim to sentimentality when she'd chosen destruction over dialogue. What about Jason? She asked. He's still sleeping. Should I wake him? That's your decision, Dad replied. But he can't stay here. My responsibility was to provide a home for my wife's son, not for my ex-wife's adult child. The legal precision of his language left no room for negotiation. Jason's tenancy in our house had been contingent on his mother's marriage to my father. With that marriage ending, his welcome had expired. He doesn't have anywhere else to go, Patricia said desperately. His father won't take him back, my parents think he's hopeless, my sister has her own problems. This is the only stable home he's known. Then maybe it's time for Jason to create his own stability, I said gently. Maybe having to figure out housing and employment and basic adult responsibilities will motivate him to develop some life skills. Patricia looked at me with something approaching gratitude, as if she was finally hearing the truth she'd been afraid to acknowledge. Jason's problems weren't going to be solved by more enabling, more excuses, more protection from natural consequences. You really think he could learn to take care of himself? She asked. I think everyone can learn if they have to, I replied. The question is whether you're going to keep preventing him from having to. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from an unknown number. The preview showed, Sophia, this is Jason. My mom told me what happened. I looked at Dad, who shrugged and nodded for me to read the full message. I opened the text and felt my eyebrows rise with surprise. Sophia, this is Jason. My mom told me what happened. I wanted to apologize for everything. I know she burned your essays because she was jealous that you're succeeding while I'm failing. That's not your fault. It's mine. Congratulations on Harvard. You earned it. I showed the message to Dad and Patricia, watching their faces register shock. In 3 years of living with us, Jason had never acknowledged his failures, never taken responsibility for his choices, never admitted that his problems were self-created rather than imposed by unfair circumstances. He sent this? Patricia asked. Her voice barely audible. Apparently losing his free housing has provided some clarity, Dad observed. Amazing how quickly people develop insight when their comfort zones disappear. Patricia's phone rang then, displaying Jason's contact information. She answered hesitantly, putting it on speaker at Dad's gesture. Mom, I'm at Marcus's apartment, Jason's voice came through clearly. I called him after I heard you packing. He said I can crash on his couch for a few weeks while I figure things out. Jason, honey, I'm so sorry, Patricia began, but he interrupted her. No, Mom. You don't need to apologize. I heard what you did to Sophia's college stuff. That was messed up. She's been nothing but nice to me, and you tried to destroy her future. Because I can't get my act together. The honesty in his voice was startling. For the first time since I'd known him, Jason sounded like an adult taking responsibility for his circumstances rather than a child expecting others to fix his problems. I talked to Marcus's dad about that construction job he mentioned, Jason continued. The one I said I was too good for. I'm going to call them Monday morning. It's time I started earning my own way instead of living off you and David. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than despair. Her son was finally showing signs of the maturity and independence she'd tried unsuccessfully to force on him for years. That sounds like a good plan, she said, her voice steadying. I'm proud of you for taking initiative. It should have happened a long time ago, Jason replied. I let you protect me from consequences until I turned into someone I don't even like. That's not your fault, Mom. That's mine. After Jason hung up, Patricia stood in our kitchen doorway holding her suitcases and looking at Dad and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Regret, certainly, but also something that might have been respect. I destroyed my marriage and my family because I couldn't accept that some people earn their success while others have to learn how to, she said quietly. I wish I could take it back. You can't take back what you did, Dad replied, but you can learn from it. Just like Jason is apparently learning from his consequences. Patricia nodded slowly, seeming to understand that this conversation was both an ending and a beginning. The ending of her role in our family, but possibly the beginning of a more honest relationship with her own son and her own choices. She walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to me. For what it's worth, she said, I hope you change the world with that law degree. I hope you honor your mother's memory by achieving everything she dreamed of. And I hope someday you'll understand that what I did came from a place of desperate love for my son, even though I expressed it in the most destructive way possible. I already understand that, I said. I just hope you understand that love without boundaries isn't actually love. It's enabling. And enabling never helps anyone grow. Patricia's face crumpled slightly, but she nodded and walked out of our house for the last time. Dad and I watched through the kitchen window as she loaded her suitcases into her BMW and drove away, leaving behind 3 years of increasingly toxic family dynamics and taking with her the lessons that might finally help her become a better mother to Jason. The house felt different immediately, lighter, cleaner, more honest. As if removing Patricia's presence had allowed the air itself to clear of accumulated resentment and manipulation. So, Dad said, surveying our destroyed kitchen with something approaching satisfaction, Harvard Law School. I guess we need to start planning for your move to Cambridge. We have time, I said, leaning against his shoulder. Classes don't start until August. And besides, we have some serious celebrating to do first. Starting with cleaning up this mess, Dad said, gesturing at the glass and ash scattered across our floor. And then calling everyone who needs to hear about your acceptance. Can we start with ordering pizza? I asked. I'm starving, and after the night we've had, I think we deserve to eat breakfast food for dinner. Dad laughed, the first genuine laughter I'd heard from him in months. Pizza for breakfast it is. We'll call it our first official celebration of Dr. Sophia Taylor's future career in civil rights law. Dr. Sophia Taylor. The title sent a thrill through me that no amount of Patricia's sabotage could have diminished. In 18 months, when I graduated from the accelerated program, that's exactly who I'd be. And I'd have earned every letter of it. 3 months later, I stood in Harvard Yard with my acceptance letter in one hand and my mother's research notebook in the other. The notebook Grandma Helen had delivered that afternoon back in October, filled with my mother's handwriting and ideas that had waited 17 years for someone to continue her work. The Cambridge campus buzzed with orientation week energy as hundreds of new students explored their future home. But I wasn't just another freshman getting her bearings. I was Dr. Sophia Taylor in training, already scheduled to meet with Professor Williams tomorrow morning to discuss my research assistant position and the civil rights clinic work that would begin immediately. Dad stood beside me, taking pictures with the enthusiasm of someone documenting a miracle. Which, in many ways, this was. 9 months ago, I'd been a high school senior hoping for acceptance to any decent college. Now I was beginning a fast-track program at the most prestigious law school in the country, with my housing and meals covered, my tuition paid, and a salary waiting for research work that aligned perfectly with my passions. Your mother would have loved this place, Dad said, gesturing toward the red brick buildings and ivy-covered walls that would be my academic home for the next 6 years. She always said Harvard felt like a place where serious work got done. I thought about the notebook in my hands, filled with my mother's observations about the failures of family court systems to protect domestic violence survivors. Her notes about how legal proceedings often re-traumatized victims instead of empowering them. Her ideas for restorative justice approaches that could heal families while still ensuring accountability for harmful behavior. Reading her research had been like discovering a treasure map to my own future. Every insight she'd recorded, every question she'd raised, every solution she'd proposed had resonated with my own experiences and observations. Working at the legal aid clinic, serving customers at Rosario's diner, even surviving Patricia's psychological warfare had given me practical understanding of exactly the problems my mother had been trying to solve. I brought something else, Dad said, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. I was saving it for move-in day, but this seems like the right moment. I carefully unwrapped the tissue paper to reveal my mother's law school ring, the one she'd worn during her paralegal certification program. It was simple but elegant, with her initials engraved on one side and the scales of justice on the other. She bought this as motivation, Dad explained. She said it would remind her why she was working so hard, what she was building toward. She wanted to wear it to every law school class, every exam, every moment when she needed to remember her purpose. I slipped the ring onto my right hand, feeling the weight of her dreams settling comfortably on my finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all this time for me to grow into it. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I was surprised to see Jason's name on the screen. We'd been texting sporadically since Patricia's departure, usually brief exchanges about his job at the construction company or updates about his night classes at community college. Saw the Harvard announcement in the local paper, his message read: Mom showed me the article about you getting the full scholarship. I wanted you to know I'm proud of you. You deserved every bit of this success. I showed the message to Dad, who smiled with genuine warmth. Jason's transformation over the past 3 months had been remarkable to witness from a distance. Without Patricia cushioning every consequence and explaining away every failure, he'd been forced to develop actual life skills and work ethic. The construction job had led to steady employment and a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. His night classes in business management were going well, and he'd even started paying Patricia rent for the apartment they now shared across town. Most importantly, he'd stopped making excuses for his previous behavior and started taking responsibility for his own future. It's amazing what people can accomplish when they have to, Dad observed. Jason just needed someone to stop rescuing him from his own choices. Speaking of which, I said, I got an email from Mrs. Chen yesterday. Apparently Patricia contacted Harvard admissions about a month after she moved out. Dad's eyebrows rose with concern. What did she want? To withdraw her complaint about my application, I said, unable to keep the amusement out of my voice. Apparently she'd filed some kind of formal objection to my acceptance, claiming I'd misrepresented my family situation or something equally ridiculous. She tried to sabotage you even after she left? Dad's voice carried the tone he used when opposing counsel made particularly offensive arguments in court. She tried, I confirmed. But Mrs. Chen said they'd already investigated the complaint thoroughly and found it completely without merit. Apparently Patricia's phone call in October, where she tried to withdraw my application entirely, had been recorded and flagged as suspicious family interference. Good, Dad said firmly. At least she eventually tried to do the right thing. According to Mrs. Chen, Patricia seemed genuinely remorseful when she called to withdraw the complaint. She apparently spent 20 minutes apologizing and explaining how her jealousy had made her act irrationally. I thought about Patricia's final attempt to control my future, how even after losing everything she'd still tried to find ways to tear me down from a distance. But I also thought about her eventual decision to undo that damage, to take responsibility for her actions and clear any obstacles she'd created. People were complicated. Even people who'd caused tremendous harm could sometimes find their way back to doing the right thing, though usually only after facing serious consequences for their poor choices. Has she been in touch otherwise? Dad asked. Just once, I said. She sent a card when the local newspaper ran the story about my scholarship. It was surprisingly thoughtful. The card had been simple, not overly emotional or manipulative. Just a brief note acknowledging my achievement and expressing hope that I'd use my opportunities to help other families avoid the kind of destructive dynamics she'd created in ours. I think losing her marriage and having to rebuild her relationship with Jason from scratch taught her some things about consequences, I continued. She seems to understand now that her enabling behavior was actually hurting him instead of helping him. Growth is possible at any age, Dad said diplomatically. Though it usually requires some pretty serious wake-up calls. We walked across Harvard Yard toward the law school building where I'd be taking my first classes in 2 weeks. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pathways where generations of future lawyers, judges, and advocates had walked while dreaming about changing the world. Are you nervous? Dad asked as we approached the building where Professor Williams's office was located. Terrified, I admitted. But also excited. I keep thinking about all the cases Mom researched, all the problems she identified, all the solutions she started developing. I have the chance to finish what she started. You have the chance to start what you're meant to do, Dad corrected gently. Your mother's work was the foundation, but what you build on it will be entirely your own. Inside the law school building, we found Professor Williams's office and knocked on the door. A warm voice called for us to enter, and we stepped into a space lined floor to ceiling with legal texts, case files, and framed photographs of civil rights milestones. Professor Williams himself was younger than I'd expected, probably in his 40s. With kind eyes and the kind of intense focus that suggested he'd spent his career thinking deeply about justice and fairness. Miss Taylor, he said, standing to shake my hand. I'm so pleased to finally meet you in person. Your essay on restorative justice has been circulating among our faculty for months. It's generated some fascinating discussions about new approaches to family law. Thank you, Professor Williams. This is my father, David Taylor. Mr. Taylor? Excellent to meet you. I understand you're a family law attorney yourself? I am, Dad replied. And I have to say, I'm incredibly proud of Sophia's insights into these issues. She's been observing family dynamics and legal systems since she was very young. That real-world perspective is exactly what makes her work so compelling, Professor Williams said. Most students write about justice in theoretical terms. Sophia writes about it as someone who's lived through both the failures and possibilities of our legal system. He gestured for us to sit down, then pulled out a thick folder marked with my name. I've been reviewing your application materials, your writing samples, and the recommendations from your teachers. But I'm particularly interested in this notebook you mentioned in your application essay. The one with your mother's research on domestic violence cases? I handed him my mother's notebook, watching as he carefully opened the worn cover and began reading her handwritten observations. His eyes widened as he turned the pages, clearly recognizing the sophistication of her analysis and the practical value of her insights. This is extraordinary, he said after several minutes. Your mother identified systemic problems that we're still struggling to address. Her proposed solutions are remarkably innovative, especially considering she developed them without formal legal training. She was planning to make it her law school thesis project, I explained. But she died before she could start classes. Well, Professor Williams said, looking up from the notebook with excitement in his eyes, what would you think about making it your thesis project instead? Not copying her work, but building on it, updating it with current legal frameworks, and developing pilot programs based on her insights. The possibility took my breath away. Not only would I be continuing my mother's work, but I'd be doing it at the highest levels of legal education, with resources and mentorship she'd never had access to. That sounds perfect, I said, my voice barely steady with emotion. Excellent. We'll start slowly, of course. First-year coursework, basic research methodology, getting you acclimated to graduate-level work. But by your third year, when you begin the law school curriculum proper, you'll be ready to tackle some serious original research. As Professor Williams outlined the program structure and research opportunities, I thought about the path that had brought me to this moment. The early loss that had shaped my understanding of injustice. The years of hard work that had built my academic credentials. The toxic family dynamics that had taught me about power, manipulation, and resilience. Even Patricia's sabotage attempt, which had ultimately revealed the strength of my support system and the futility of trying to tear down someone who'd already survived real adversity, every challenge, every obstacle, every moment of doubt had been preparation for exactly this opportunity. I was sitting in Harvard Law School, planning to continue my mother's work on justice reform, with a full scholarship and the support of professors who believed in my potential. "There's one more thing," Professor Williams said as our meeting concluded. "We'd like you to present your preliminary research at the National Conference on Family Law Reform next spring. It's unusual for an undergraduate to receive that kind of platform, but your unique perspective and your mother's groundbreaking insights deserve a wider audience." After leaving Professor Williams's office, Dad and I walked back across Harvard Yard in comfortable silence. The evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and students were beginning to gather in groups for dinner and conversation. "So," Dad said eventually, "how does it feel to be exactly where you're supposed to be?" I thought about the question as we reached the spot where we'd started our campus tour hours earlier. Patricia had tried to burn my future because she couldn't stand watching me succeed while her son failed. She'd assumed that destroying my essays would destroy my dreams, that removing opportunities would remove possibilities, but she'd fundamentally misunderstood what success actually meant. It wasn't about papers or applications or external validation. It was about becoming the kind of person who could survive setbacks, learn from challenges, and transform obstacles into stepping stones. "It feels like coming home," I said finally. "Like everything that happened, good and bad, led to exactly this moment." "Your mother would be so proud," Dad said, pulling me into one of his signature hugs. "And so would she be amazed by the young woman you've become." As we walked toward our car to begin the drive back home, I thought about the notebook in my backpack, the ring on my finger, and the future stretching out ahead of me like an open book waiting to be written. Patricia had tried to burn my essays, but she'd only succeeded in burning away the illusions that had held our family back from honesty and growth. In the end, her sabotage had revealed exactly who everyone really was, and those revelations had set us all free to become who we were meant to be. Tomorrow I would begin the work of honoring my mother's memory by continuing her mission. And somewhere across town, Jason was probably getting ready for another day of honest work while Patricia learned what it meant to support someone's growth instead of enabling their stagnation. Everyone had found their way to exactly where they needed to be. Even if none of us had expected the journey to unfold quite like this, justice, it turned out, had a way of revealing itself through the most unexpected paths. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.